10 minutes. Is that true?
More or less.
Are you going to take 10 minutes?
You have 12 minutes.
Okay. All right.
Since I'm only going to read it, I think it'll take 5 minutes of Bev's paper.
Okay. 12 minutes is fine. Hopefully we'll have a conversation.
So, folks, welcome back again. I'm delighted you're here. And that first session, I think, was extremely stimulating and illuminating. And I think this session is a natural follow-up. One of the things that we're interested in this session is how did America First really revive? And in what form did America First revive after Pearl Harbor, after it seemed to have been a totally devastated, decimated movement. And yet, during the late 1940s, and particularly in the 50s and 60s, even when America's Cold War liberal internationalism prevailed, there were these underlying currents that would eventually bubble up into the more contemporary America First movement. And so that's what we're interested in discussing today. And we have two terrific people on the panel. We had a third terrific person named Beverly Gage from Yale, who was supposed to be here, but her plane was fogged in late yesterday afternoon in New Haven, and she was unable to get any other plane that would get her to Charlottesville in time for this panel. So you can imagine going from small New Haven airport to our sort of cosmopolitan airport here in Charlottesville presents certain difficulties. So what I'm going to do after the first two presentations is read a few essential paragraphs from Bev Gage's paper, just to give you a sense of her argument, which I think is a very important and provocative argument. But first, we'll hear from David Farber, who's the Roy Roberts Professor at the University of Kansas. David has written an incredible number of important books. The one that arguably is most relevant to this conference is his book about the rise and fall of modern conservatism. But David has written very, very broadly on business policy in America, business-government relations, and even more particularly on social movements and also the relationships of student protest. He has a very important, interesting, provocative book about the 1960s, I think one edited book and one actual monograph about the 1960s. So I'm delighted that David is here with us today. Our second speaker will be Jeffrey Kabaservis, who's now the Director of Policy Studies at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., which is not a think tank, is a think tank not as well known as some of the others like Brookings or Cato or American Heritage, but is a new think tank in Washington that's focused on open society and transparency. And as I just said, he's the Director of Policy Studies there. He's written two books, one of which is extremely related to what we're discussing today. It's called Rule and Ruin: The Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. And that was published in 2013. He has a more recent book called The Guardians, which is about Kingsman Brewster, his circle, and the liberal establishment, which was published in 2014 or 2015. And he's going to talk to us today about conservatism, America First, and the 1950s. So I'll turn this over, first of all, to David.
My thanks to Mel and to Will Hitchcock and to the Miller Center for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to hear you all. What I'm going to do is build in some ways on the first panel and use it as foundational, and then kind of move us into what I think of as that liminal period in U.S. history between the end of World War II and the beginnings of the Cold War, and to think about the ways in which America First, not so much as a replicant of that America First committee, but as a notion, as a sentiment, as a set of feelings, ideas, and practical policies, plays itself out during this liminal period of the 1940s and 50s, a time when it wasn't clear what the role of the United States would be in the world, or what role Americans should play in a very changing, dynamic international economy, as well as a changing national security profile. So my goal here is to try to complicate the narrative of what America First is by honing in less on the kinds of things many of the panelists are going to hone in most particularly on: international security arrangements, the United States' role in protecting Europe, reciprocal military obligations, and think instead about what I'll argue was central to the belief of America First in the 1940s and 50s, and very much in the 21st century, which is what is the role of the United States in the international economy. So switching ground from national security to international economic relationships, and that's my goal. I think when Donald Trump talks most particularly about America First, yes, he's very invested in what the United States' military obligations are in NATO. He's very invested in the kind of treaty rights or agreements that have been made in the United States, the Paris Accords and others. But I think what resonated with the American people above all else was his sense that the United States' role in the international economy was not working to benefit enough of them. And I think that very same sentiment, that there's something about international economic arrangements that does not figure most advantageously for enough Americans, is what was at the core of the aftermath of the American First movement after World War II. So that's going to be kind of what I'm trying to think about. And again, to go back to what our first panel said, it's useful to remember that in some ways the liberal internationalism that has so dominated all of our lives, that really is a factor from Roosevelt to Obama, was not the norm in the United States, that the default position of the United States was not a liberal internationalism, but was a more unilateral, perhaps pejoratively isolationist worldview, and that was resonant too with the U.S.'s economic position in the world. I'm a 20th century historian. I get nervous when I talk about anything that happened before around 1940. But let's not forget, for those of you who can vaguely remember your U.S. History Survey course, that in the 19th century, one of the most animating of all political issues was the tariff. And that the Republican Party emerges in many ways as a party, yes, of free labor, but also as a protectionist, tariff-oriented political party. And so the Republican Party's emphasis on free trade, which we think is normative, was actually transformative during the period I'm talking about. So tariffs are usually not a lot of fun to talk about, and I'll avoid too much technical talk. But what I want to get across is when people started using the phrase America First after the implosion of the American First Committee, so right after Pearl Harbor, the American First Committee implodes, it's gone, it's forgotten, but the phrase America First does not disappear. And throughout World War II, you hear people intone that same phrase. They are not using the phrase America First to say by 1943, let's get out of World War II, let's stop fighting the Nazis or the Japanese. But they're portending their fears in the mid-1940s that the war's end will produce a new economic order oriented more around free trade, or at least freer trade, than the traditional protectionist economic environment that certainly most American manufacturers thought was necessary and useful. So that's what I want us to be thinking about, international economic relationships, not so much international security relations. So the progenitor of that movement, the figure who is most prominent in that movement by the mid-1940s and will continue, is the man who thought he would be president over and over again, Mr. Republican, the senator from Ohio, Robert Taft, who thought of himself as the ideological heart and the practical political leader of the Republican Party for about 10 years. Whether he was or isn't is an interesting contested question we'll be talking a little bit about here today. But what I want to get across is that in the mid-1940s, you started to see vocally within the Republican Party a very clear split about economic issues. This begins in the 1930s, and I want to go back just very briefly to remind you of something that wasn't mentioned in the prior panel. In the 1930s, there is also a war, not about domestic politics per se, but about how economic production will move forward during the Great Depression and in the immediate aftermath. Franklin Roosevelt aligns himself with economic internationalists. He aligns himself with economic elites who were invested in international trade and international investment. We tend to think of Roosevelt as being famous for his speech in which he calls out the captains of industry and describes them as being the new robber barons of the 20th century. But Roosevelt was closely aligned with Wall Street bankers, for example. There were several banks that supported his campaigns throughout the 1930s. Why? Because Roosevelt was aligned toward international trade and international investment. Republicans were quite aware of that. Some agreed with that. Most famously, Wendell Willkie, Dewey, also was on line with that same approach. The internationalist wing of the Republican Party was also aligned with some of those same economic interests. Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, was not. He aligned himself with Midwest manufacturing interests. Those interests were extremely trepidatious about the idea that they would face economic competition from abroad based on lower wages and closer access to resources. So when Roosevelt begins to move forward with his economic agenda in the 1930s, and again, sorry about this, by passing the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreement, the Republican Party splits over this very specific economic engine of growth. Taft and others opposed it, were anti-free trade. And between the 1930s and the early 1950s, Robert Taft would go in front of any group that would have him and say over and over again, the Republican Party is opposed to free trade. It was that explicit. We do not support free trade. It's not good for the American people. It's not good for American business. It's not good for the American standard of living, by which I guess he meant American wages. So the big divide in the Republican Party from the 1930s into the mid-1940s was over trade policy. And my argument here is that when we think of America first in the 40s and 50s, yes, we should think about the divide over NATO. Should the United States be a participant or not? Should the United States support GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs? Should the United States agree to be supportive of international investment? But tariffs, protectionism, was at the core of these policies. So when we see Trump talk 70 years later about these same issues, he is not denying the roots of the Republican Party, ironically, but is returning to them in some fundamental ways. And I think that's something that we haven't reckoned with very much during this period of time. In the 1940s, Taft and Eisenhower start to fence over this issue at the very end of the 1940s. And in 1951, Taft is hoping that he will become the Republican nominee for the presidency in 1952. And to sort of launch his campaign, he gives a speech in the Senate where he lays out his economic vision for the United States. And he says explicitly, the United States should maintain a high tariff economy. He argues vociferously against the United States giving favorable terms to capital investments outside the United States. He's trying to figure out mechanisms by which money has to be maintained within the United States. When Dwight Eisenhower decides that he's going to run for the presidency, and I need Hitchcock here to make sure I don't screw this up too badly, Eisenhower explicitly repudiates the economic messages that Taft has laid out. He explicitly says the United States will have to enable a global economy that will assure prosperity for countries around the world if we're going to create a secure, stable environment for the United States' peoples and the peoples around the world. Taft is infuriated by this speech and explicitly goes out in front of newspaper reporters and says he's putting foreigners ahead of Americans. He doesn't use the phrase America first, but it's implicit in what he's saying at that period of time. Now, most Republicans are divided over this issue. And as the Cold War heats up, by 1947, as big votes have to come into play, where senators and members of the House have to actually literally explicitly vote on support for the new internationalism that's built around the ideal of the United States standing off the Soviet Union, there's a lot of hedging that goes on within the Republican Party. Taft himself starts to change his positions in some ways. He recognizes that the United States will have to play another role. Taft is a fierce anti-communist. So he does believe that there'll have to be extraterritorial defenses for the United States to support our allies. He believes that limited foreign investment is necessary. He believes that some small amounts of foreign aid will be useful. But he does not support the Marshall Plan. He does not support massive investment. And over again, he says, we cannot allow a reciprocal free trade set of agreements to come up. And in January 1953, as Eisenhower has defeated Taft for the nomination, is now going to become inaugurated as president, Taft lists out a series of priorities for his legislative agenda that he's going to pursue. First and foremost on that list is to fight against reciprocal free trade agreements. Second is to fight against U.S. foreign investment being given favorable treatment under the tax code. And he continues a series of lists along these ways. He sees a political economy still built around protecting domestic manufacturers in the United States to maintain American standards of living in order to protect the American people from what he sees as unfair trade advantages that Europe and the rest of the country, the rest of the world have over the United States. Eisenhower faces a very difficult situation when it comes to these economic questions. He has to convince both Democrats, who have often been also ambivalent about trade, in part because of their allegiance in some parts of the country to trade union movements, but also his own industrial base in the Republican Party, basically the Midwest, the Rust Belt today, what we would call it, and to convince them why we would have to give these advantages to foreign peoples. This comes to a head, actually, not around Europe, but around Japan in the mid-1950s. Japan is slow to develop in the mid-1950s out of a penurious situation. And by the mid-1950s, the Japanese are still basically dependent on rice gruel. Their economy is weak. They're having a hard time rejoining the league, an international prosperous realm. Eisenhower pulls in the Senate Republican leadership, and he says to them, we're in a very difficult situation with Japan. There's a risk that they might fall into the influence of China. Remember, it's 1955, 1949, the revolution has occurred in China. Korea has become complex and divided. And he says the only way we're going to be able to give Japan a leg up into a new world in which they'll ally themselves with us is by providing them favorable trade terms. We're going to have to actually sacrifice some American economic interests in order to assure that Japan can prosper in this new world that's being built by us, by our leadership. And the Republican leadership is basically caught in the switches between its anti-communist sentiments and its concern about defending the American worker and, more importantly, from their interests, American capital, from what they see as unfair advantages. This is probably one of the most important votes that takes place, and it's decided by Republican leadership to support a more freer trade, or in some ways, an advantaged trade for some of America's nascent allies. And from the 1950s onward, a series of trade agreements are made by both Democrats and Republicans all through into the 1960s that are actually providing favorable trade terms for America's allies, both in Europe and in Asia during this period of time. So it's not reciprocal free trade, it's actually advantaged trade for our allies to enable them to gain the prosperity that we hope will ensure domestic, international security. During this period of time, America is in some ways enabled by its own prosperity to avoid the hard political questions that such trade arrangements might cause or ensue for a variety of constituents in the United States. So for about a period of 15 years, there's a sense in which the sacrifices that Eisenhower had told his Senate colleagues, the Senate Republican leadership would ensue, we're going to have to give away something to gain something, is in some ways mitigated by America's global economic leadership. By the late 1960s, that economic advantage begins to dissipate. Foreign capital investments are creating troubles over our very straightforward issues about currency and gold standards. And there starts to rise within both the Democratic and the Republican Party a set of concerns about foreign investment and whether or not the United States can maintain this new set of arrangements. Despite changing economic circumstances by the late 1960s and early 70s, there's no presidential nominee from a major party, however, that fully embraces this new economic complexity in terms of international trade relations. It's so built into the cake by this time that it's really hard for most American politicians to reimagine those trade relationships. There's some exceptions. Walter Mondale, when he runs against Reagan, brings up some of the complexities of these problems. But it's not until 2016 that a major party candidate says essentially that the system that we created to handle one set of problems perhaps is not as pertinent as it once was. There's probably not that many of us in this room that think that Donald Trump has the intellectual capacity to imagine the 75-year transition in trade relationships that ensued. But in his gut, and he is a gut player, he understood that the transitional period of time, 75 years, in which trade advantages were given away freely by the United States, maybe doesn't play the same way as it did in 1947 to 1955. So I'm no Trump supporter, but America First is in some ways not the stupidest idea that anyone ever said.
Actually, no, I would like the microphone, if I can get it. I was going to, a la Donald Trump, toss away my speech, but unlike Trump, I'd have to pick it up myself, so. Thank you. Is it on? Okay, great. Something there is that doesn't love a podium. I actually wanted to go back to something that Bill Buckley told me when I asked him about this reputation of America First, very much like you articulated, Professor Loeffler, at the beginning of the presentation, that America First has this reputation of being isolationist, nativist, insular, anti-Semitic, racist. And Buckley often went on at great length, but his reply in his case as to why it had this reputation was quite succinct. He said, "Victor's justice." And there is a sense in which the way we think about the America First Committee is a reflection of the victory of the forces that opposed it, and the way that that narrative has gone relatively unchallenged, even by historians, to the present day. So I want to tell you about my own personal encounter with America First. I first went into the America First Committee papers at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University 25 years ago, which seems like a long time ago. And I was not actually inquisiting America First's relationship to conservatism as such. I was looking at its relationship to the progressive wing of the Republican Party, because I was writing about Kingman Brewster, who was the president of Yale in the 60s and 70s, and then became Jimmy Carter's ambassador to the Court of St. James. And he was a very prominent progressive liberal Republican. And he had helped found the America First Committee at Yale University in the summer to fall of 1940, along with a number of students at the Yale Law School. Brewster at that time was chairman of the Yale Daily News. That was actually in some ways the most visible position on campus, which is why the law school organizers wanted Brewster as part of their organization. And the thing that we tend to forget is, looking back on this, what was the press coverage of America First like at the time? What was the press coverage of isolationism like? And was it focused on the Midwest? Boy, conservative Midwestern farmers oppose getting involved in Europe. Big surprise. In further news, water is wet and runs downhill. No, they were very interested in why it was the students at the Ivy League colleges, America's aristocracy, people of English descent, wealthy people, people who had gone to prep schools, whose parents had fought in World War I. Why were they opposed to World War I? That was a big deal. Arthur Schlesinger, in his memoirs, said that, as bitter as the 1960s were and the debates over Vietnam, they were nothing compared to the divisions that were created in the run-up to World War II and America's participation in that war. It tore families apart. And it particularly tore families apart in these eastern coastal areas where places like the people at Yale came from. And a lot of explanations were put forward as to why America First was created at Yale, why the students believed this sort of thing, because it was in many ways a student movement. And we tend to forget that. But it began as a student movement, an elite student movement, but still a student movement. And Brewster recruited participants at the Ivy League colleges, at universities up and down the coast during this time as well. And the explanations that came forward, yes, they were listening to why the students were saying, and it did have a lot to do with World War I, as was mentioned in the last panel. But a lot of it was, it came down to the victory of scientific naturalism over more Victorian Edwardian ways of thinking. In other words, these were kind of negative debunking theories that showed up in all kinds of the social sciences. Yale Law School, not coincidentally, was the hotbed of legal realism, which again kind of threw out this whole emphasis on precedent, was caricatured as law is what the judge believes it is, but essentially said, the old ways of thinking are irrelevant. And that was very much what the students believed during this time as well. The Victorian fussiness and kind of elevation of these outdated ideals were simply that modern students were not going to take it. And Brewster's co-editor on the Yale Daily News famously described as World War I as a subterfuge for pulling imperial chestnuts out of the fire. So this was kind of where the emphasis was during that period. Now, we tend to forget this aspect of World War I as a liberal Republican movement, or just a liberal movement writ large, because the people who were in that movement did not defend it after World War II, after the conclusion of the war. And obviously, they all joined the services and fought in the war as well. So I talked to Robert Douglas Stewart Jr., who was probably the founder of the organization at Yale, and asked him how he felt about the reputation of the America First Committee after World War II. And he said, well, obviously we didn't list it on our resumes. But if it was as vile an organization as has been claimed, if it was that awful thing, then there would have been something like lustration with regard to people who had been members of it. And there wasn't. In fact, most of the people at Yale, like Potter Stewart, like Gerald Ford, like Kingman Brewster, like Sergeant Shriver, went on to become ardent internationalists. And in some ways, it was a helpful experience for Brewster to have been in the student movement, because it meant that he understood the student movements in the 1960s. And he understood that this comparison of, the unpatriotic students of the 60s who were shirking their military duty to go fight in Vietnam and were opposed by the patriotic members of the greatest generation who had all gone in there and fought, it was a false comparison, because those students in the greatest generation had opposed going into World War II a generation earlier. And they had been opposed to their parents and had just as bitter tensions as happened in the 1960s. And being a student gave Brewster some insight into how student movements behave, how they react, how to react to them. And it was interesting. His best friend at Yale was McGeorge Bundy in the class of 1940, who was an ardent interventionist. He, in fact, wrote one of the entries in 0 Hour, A Summons to the Free, which was the famous internationalist book edited by Stephen Vincent Benet. And Bundy arguably overlearned the lessons of Munich, which is what led to Vietnam. And Brewster was always very skeptical of this participation, and some of it may have stemmed from their pre-war experiences as well. And the other thing that the people who had been involved in the American First Committee at the start learned was that populism is dangerous. And one of the things that Stewart said that stuck with me is that it was a mistake to change the name of the organization. The organization was meant to counter the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. So they chose a somewhat parallel name, the Emergency Committee to Defend America First. When you take out that defend part and it just becomes the America First Committee, it changes from a distinction between means to one of ends. We want to defend America first. You want to defend somebody else first. And then it, as also was mentioned, I think, by Professor Zelikow, the organization escaped its kind of elite non-membership Constitution. It became a popular organization, it became a populist organization, and then you had all these other associations coming in, which is why a lot of the people who'd organized the America First Committee actually dropped out well before December 1941. Brewster dropped out after the Lend-Lease Act was passed in the spring of 1941. And obviously, all kinds of people disassociated themselves from Charles Lindbergh's remark in Des Moines and would point out that Lindbergh was never actually a member of the America First Committee. So anyway, then I crossed paths with Bill Buckley at about that same time. I spent about 5 years burrowing through Buckley's archives at Yale, surfacing occasionally, and would go down to Stanford to talk to Buckley himself. And the thing about Buckley is that he repented of some of his positions in his wild youth. It was actually very important for, I think, the evolution of American conservatism that Buckley said, I made a mistake about Jim Crow segregation. Federal government intervention was necessary. The South was not going to evolve itself out of segregation. Buckley never repented of isolationism. He continued to maintain that the United States had made a disastrous mistake by entering World War II. And some of the lessons that Buckley and the other conservatives took with them from the American First Committee experience were very different from those that those in the progressive wing of the Republican Party took with them. So one of the things Buckley saw was that this was a populist movement that could be turned to conservative ends. There was a mass popular market for conservative ideas. That was one of the real lessons that he drew. That was a lesson that he further believed was reinforced by McCarthyism, and to some extent by massive resistance against desegregation in the South. And Buckley said that one of the greatest moments of his entire life was when he was at the great America First Committee rally in New York City with John Flynn and Charles Lindbergh, and life could offer no higher pleasure than that. The pageantry of the American flags and the people gathered of one accord. And this is where the populism comes in. I've been reading Bill Galston's latest book called Anti-Pluralism, which in many ways is about the dangers of populism, not just here in the United States, but abroad as well. And populism really has as its basic conception that the people are unitary and one and correct. And they are ever thwarted by elites. And the people by definition cannot be wrong. So if something happens that's bad, it must be the fault of elites. And this, to Buckley, was very much the story of World War II. The American people did not want to enter into this conflict as he saw it. And it's true, the polls showed 70 to 80% opposition to intervention in World War II unless the United States was itself attacked before the war. And from this, Buckley drew the lesson that the people had to be manipulated into the war, that it was FDR who had done most of the manipulation, that FDR had actually chosen to defend Britain before the United States and its Pearl Harbor outpost, therefore inviting attack. And this also gave rise in certain circles of conservatism that FDR had advanced knowledge of the attack and had suppressed this knowledge so that the United States would be drawn into World War II against the will of the people. And this is one of the very first episodes where you really see the conservative appetite for conspiracy theories about the treachery of liberal elites. And beyond that, Buckley said it wasn't just Roosevelt who was arrayed against the will of the people, it was the establishment or establishments of all kinds. And Buckley was one of the very first people to actually popularize this term establishment in this country. And he had first in mind the Republican Party establishment, because they had deprived the people of a free choice in 1940 by nominating Wendell Willkie. Because Wendell Willkie was, if anything, a more ardent interventionist than was Roosevelt himself. And later wrote the book One World, right? So that's not what you wanted. You wanted to give the American people a choice, not an echo, the phrase later used in the Goldwater period. And from this, Buckley and the other conservatives took the conviction there was a hidden majority of Americans who would respond to the conservative message if they were given a choice between the Tweedledum of the Democratic Party and the Tweedledee of the Republican Party. And Buckley said it wasn't just the Republican establishment, it wasn't just FDR, it was the establishment writ large, the liberal establishment. And he never chose to specifically define that because it was useful not to define it specifically, but by this he really meant elites in both parties, elites more generally, the big metropolitan newspapers, the media, the radio stations, the universities, the big Protestant denominations, any kind of organization or group or set of individuals that had power and influence in society. They were all arrayed against the America First Committee, and they dropped multiple calumnies on it which survived to the present day. So our idea of the AFC as a collection of Jew haters and Roosevelt haters and anti-laborites and all that, as Buckley would see it, comes from that period and the success in carrying over that narrative. In fact, Time magazine kept attacking Charles Lindbergh during the war itself, which provoked the young Buckley to write not just a letter to Time denouncing them for anti-Americanism, but to report Time to the FBI in the hopes that they would do something about it. But again, from this came the conviction after the war that the establishment had to be brought down by any means necessary. And we're all familiar with conservative animus against the media. That certainly dates to this time. Fred Siegel has pointed out that in many ways McCarthyism, the subject of our absent friend Bev Lynn's paper, was in many ways the politics of revenge against the establishment. But it wasn't just revenge against the foreign policy establishment, it was a revenge against all the establishment. And there was an interesting quote from Pat Buchanan, who, as we'll also hear, kind of picked up this banner of America First as well. He said, you know, the great thing about McCarthy was that he did to the American establishment what the New Deal Democrats had done to the business elite and Wall Street. He forever destroyed the American people's belief in their natural leadership. And this, again, stemmed from the battles before and leading up to World War II itself. And even the talk we have nowadays about political correctness, in Buckley's view, went back to this because not just before the war, not just during the war, even after the war, any kind of revisionist scholarship was beyond the bounds of polite discourse. It was not allowed. Harry Elmer Barnes, just to use one example, was more or less ostracized from the profession for persisting in revisionism. And Mr. Buckley was a symbol of the liberal establishment's absolute coercive conformity. Now, this is a little hypocritical because Buckley himself believed in coercive conformity, just of the right, not the left. He wanted to replace the left's coercive conformity with his own. But as he saw it, the left would not admit that Pearl Harbor and everything leading up to Pearl Harbor was the foundational error of the entire subsequent post-war enterprise. Buckley saw the whole world after that as, in some sense, a mistake. This is his famous statement in the opening issue of National Review that he wanted to stand athwart history yelling, "Stop." Buckley simply didn't believe in the post-war international order that came out of this. Therefore, Buckley was never that invested in the argument, let's say, over Vietnam. His belief there was, hey, you created this world, it's your mess, you deal with it. And there was a certain sense of conservative washing of hands of this. Now, anti-communism, of course, became a very important part of conservatism because it was the third leg of the stool that tied together libertarian conservatism with more traditional kinds of conservatism. And those other two forms didn't really have much in common, but they could actually agree on anti-communism as the basis for fusionism. But anti-communism was, again, kind of a negative thing. And granted, there were some variations, like the fact that you could have Asia-firsters in the conservative community. But again, their love of Asia was only sort of skin deep. No one really cared about India. People got bored when it came to point four. And, you know, Buckley also would be the first to point out that the anti-communism was itself kind of a compromise with the original vision of Robert Taft. And people kind of went along with Robert Taft in believing that this big state that was created to wage the Cold War was in many ways a continuation of the New Deal. And particularly on the far libertarian side of things, there was always real nostalgia for Taft's idea of pre-war America as just kind of a night watchman state. There would not be the taxation that was required to build up this apparatus. The United States would not be intervening in conflicts in which it had no interest. There would not be the big government that Americans had just come to accept that was necessary to prosecute this war. Now, Buckley, I think, also drew another lesson from the America First experience, which was that, as he saw it, Lindbergh's great mistake was in uttering open anti-Semitic remarks and allowing the media to thereby discredit the movement as a whole. Buckley was always very careful to keep anti-Semitism out of the conservative movement of his own. But that's not the same thing as Buckley agreeing to the world as it existed at that time. And I think Buckley never made peace with the liberal international order, and I think a lot of other conservatives never did either. And you could see this in their resistance to executive power. And the last big isolationist or anti-interventionist movement, however you want to call it, was actually after World War II. It was for America in the early 1950s. It was organized around support of the Bricker Amendment by Indiana Senator John Bricker, which aimed in various forms to require congressional authorization for executive declaration of war or other kinds of intervention or treaty passage. So in many ways, this suspicion of the executive lingered on through the Eisenhower years, on into the Nixon years. Conservatives opposed Nixon's opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union. It persisted even through the Reagan years and has never really come to rest. And Arthur Schlesinger, who was a very perceptive observer of his opponents, the conservatives, pointed out that while isolationism disappeared after World War II as a program and a doctrine, it survived as a set of emotions that never disappeared. And this is a latent tendency in conservatism throughout the whole period and up to the present day. And it can be drawn upon by Pat Buchanan or by Donald Trump, because it's really deep in the American people that they want to live on their own according to their own ways. They do not want to be beholden to international institutions. Many of them do not trust organizations like the United Nations or the various pacts in which they feel they're being hard done by. Suspicion of foreigners is something that goes very deeply in the American psyche, and it's never been eradicated. And for this reason, I think isolationism or the isolationist impulse is with us still and will continue.
As I said, Beverly Gage could not make it, so I asked her if it would be all right if I read selective portions of the paper that she submitted, and she said that I should do so. So I'm not going to read her whole paper by any means, but I will read a few key passages that I think convey the essence of it. I think it's an important paper and leaves a lot for us to think about. So I begin. On May 21st, 1940, White House aide, Franklin Roosevelt's aide, Stephen Early, dispatched a fresh stack of telegrams to the FBI. Quote, "The president thought you might like to look them over, noting the names and addresses of the senders," Early suggested to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. 5 days earlier, reacting to Hitler's invasion of France, Franklin Roosevelt had warned of ominous days ahead for Europe, and he called upon Americans to act before it was too late. The president's request that Hoover, quote, "look over those letters and keep tabs on their senders," has often been told as a story of presidential overreach, a demand for a naked political favor in an election year from an executive branch appointee duty-bound to stay out of the electoral fray. This speaks to a long and rocky history of FBI enmeshment in presidential politics. And here's her key paragraph, I think. Hoover's cooperative relationship with Roosevelt underscores one of the central paradoxes of the FBI director's career. As a bureaucrat and state builder, Hoover came of age in the heyday of the liberal state. The tiny Bureau of Investigation became the mighty FBI during the Roosevelt years. In effect, if not in every detail, the FBI was just another New Deal alphabet agency. At the same time, Hoover had little patience for many of the New Deal's ideological presumptions, including the liberal internationalism at the heart of Roosevelt's war effort. With the end of the war, the vast bureaucracy built to secure Roosevelt's political vision became a vehicle for promoting Hoover's own America First message, in which the struggle against the Communist Party and its left liberal allies reigned supreme. In a political twist that the president himself might have appreciated, the Domestic Intelligence Service created to serve Roosevelt's ideal of a New Deal for the world, ultimately became one of the greatest state-centered constraints on New Deal liberalism and on Roosevelt's post-war domestic legacy. Hoover's investigation of Roosevelt's anti-interventionist critics, far from being an isolated instance of overreach, was part of the FBI's response to Early's request, and it fit a broader pattern of expanding intelligence and espionage operations. These efforts continued. Indeed, they expanded again after Pearl Harbor. Though the America First Committee officially dissolved in December 1941, the FBI continued to track its activities, warning of members' hope that the America First Committee can again be a political force, end quote. Instead, it was the FBI itself that emerged from the war as a formidable and increasingly independent political force with its own interpretation of what America First might mean. Quote, "Let us be steadfast for America, work and live for America, and eternally be on guard to defend our Constitution and our way of life against the virulent poison of communist ideology," end quote, Hoover urged the American Legion in September 1946. And by this point, Hoover had acquired both the bureaucratic power and the political influence to help make that vision a reality. After 6 years of wartime expansion, Hoover found himself in a position to realize his own ideological agenda and to prod the country into its next great home front battle. Thank you. So we have a lot of food for thought here, and I have some questions, but I think that the discussion earlier this morning from the audience was really good. So let's start off with some questions from the audience. Will Hitchcock.
Great thing about organizing a conference is you can always ask the first question of every panel, or at least that's what so far. That was just a terrific panel, and you set the stage for, I think, a really interesting discussion. I want to ask you both about, sorry, Beverly, I'm not going to. I want to ask David and Jeff a little bit about elites versus the people. So it's considered kind of conventional wisdom that elites are internationalists and Davos type people, and populists are working people or ordinary people. And you've just shown us that the two key figures in the isolationist / unilateralist / America First movement are preeminent American elites. Robert Taft with a Harvard and a Yale degree and the son of a president, and Buckley, one needn't say more about his elitism. So what has pulled elites of their stature, their standing, their sophistication, their education level, their understanding of American, their cosmopolitanism, dare I say it, towards becoming the tribune of populists, people who I dare say neither of these two men, Robert Taft and Bill Buckley, would want to spend an afternoon with, rubbing elbows. What's going on? Tell us a little bit more about why they felt they were primed to speak for the great unwashed, people they probably would not let into their own clubs. Thanks.
Well, I think the first thing to ponder is who's an elite and on what terms. So Robert Taft, intriguingly, did not go to New York City after he graduated from Yale Law School, but instead went back to Ohio and became a member of a leading firm in Ohio that represented manufacturers in his home state. So he was definitely a member of the elite,
but not that elite. And I think one of the things that we do at our peril is to think of a unified elite in the United States rather than recognize the tremendous battles that go on within elites. So again, rule of thumb is that the New Deal caused a rift in the economic elite in the United States. It was not Roosevelt, the tribune of the people, versus the economic royalists on the other side. Again, I said it in the speech, but it's really useful to understand that a kind of peace was reached in the early 20th century between big bankers and the Democratic Party. And that really had massive repercussions throughout. Taft was not aligned with the banking industry in the 1940s and 50s. Your boy Eisenhower had a much closer relationship with those kind of folks. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. They're both elites and they both have interests, but they have very different interests. And the Republican Party has been wrestling with those contending, we could put it as simple as terms as Main Street and Wall Street, except Main Street being maybe giant manufacturers. Just to go into one very specific, because I wrote a book about it, and maybe you should all go buy it. I wrote a book about General Motors, and the leader of General Motors is a guy named Alfred Sloan, again, MIT graduate, vastly wealthy and elite by any sense of the word. He supported Robert Taft throughout, was very anxious about Eisenhower, because General Motors had done a very particular kind of corporate structuring, where rather than exporting products, they bought companies all over the world and allowed those companies in Germany or England or Australia or Canada or pretty much every other major country in the world to manufacture cars for that home market. So they had a very different take then on what was good or bad for General Motors in terms of international economic policy. They gambled on a non-investment oriented approach toward export. So anyway, it really gets down to the particularities rather than some sort of abstract ideology. So elites have different interests depending on their exact relationship to a whole series of things.
David, let me just follow up on that. Because earlier this morning, Chris Nichols said, the way to understand America First is sort of a populist movement against elites. But here you're telling us, right, that there's at least a fragment of the elites, a very significant one, that constitutes sort of a core element of the America First movement, or a core element of a conservatism that had sort of linkages. If that's true, is it helpful to think of America First as a populist movement against elites when they are actually led by elites?
Well, I can do a quick version of that, which is, again, there is a populist strain in American constituencies that are anxious about foreigners. Which foreigners and for what reasons divvies them up into different groups. And really, in some ways, the genius of Ronald Reagan through Donald Trump, there's continuity there, is figuring out how to explicate which foreigners are dangerous to you and for what reasons. But there's always some foreigners that are dangerous to you, or others that are dangerous to you.
But does
Both
that-
parties do it. So does that make you an elite or a populist?
I'm going to weigh
That
in
makes
here.
you a politician.
I'm going to weigh in here. There's a great episode where Mrs. Robert Taft was surrounded by reporters, and they asked her, "Do you think your husband is a common man?" And she said, No, of course not. He was first in his class at Yale and first in his class at Harvard Law School. He's anything but a common man. I think it would be wrong to have a common man representing the people of Ohio. And all the political professionals are like, oh my God. And everyone in the audience applauded. It's not a question of who you are. If you have elite coloration, this is the same trap that all the liberals fell into. Well, no one's going to vote for Donald Trump out in the heartland. He's this New York billionaire. They have nothing in common with them. He has nothing in common with them. It's not about who you are in that sense. It's about who you're against. And Taft, like Trump now, was against the establishment and the elites. And, this has always been the essence of populism. It's against cosmopolitans. It's against the East Coast. It's against the bankers. It's against the railroads. It's against the big companies. Sometimes it's against the Jews. But, it's all of these things that are not perceived as being us heartland people. And it's also the people who are in your way if you're rising up. So in many ways, Trump, like Taft, like Buckley, becomes the tribune of a struggling and insecure middle class. And this was made clear to Buckley, who was no one's idea of, again, a man of the people, when he ran for mayor of New York City. And he's kind of running on basic pocketbook issues. He's going to slash the deficit, that sort of thing. And he finds that he's getting this huge response from the outer borough ethnics, who are like, screw John Lindsay, screw these WASP elites, screw their liberalism, give us our moment in the sun. You can take us there, Buckley. Knock them down. So again, it's not that we can sort of judge a populist from their background, from anything else about them. Buckley had gone to Yale. Buckley was in Skull and Bones. It's more a matter of what they're taking down, what kind of establishment they're opposing, and how they do it.
Yeah, Bob Kagan? Yeah.
Thanks. Those were terrific presentations, and I just wanted to follow up on Jeffrey's discussion, because one of the things that struck me at the end of the Cold War, thank you for not have to step on that cup 15 times, was the degree to which so many conservatives who were leading Cold Warriors and therefore leading internationalists in the sense of believing the United States would be involved everywhere, as soon as the Cold War was over, turned against that kind of foreign policy entirely. And this was not just the sort of people who are known as paleocons, but it was also true of people who were known as neocons. Irving Kristol said there was no need for NATO anymore. Jeane Kirkpatrick said it was time to become a normal nation, not carry this great burden. Norman Podhoretz said we don't have to do this anymore. I mean, there was the degree to which their internationalism was linked to communism only, not to a sense that they had expressed about America's role in the world, was very striking. So the question I have, especially since, you're certainly right that certainly in the McCarthy era, a lot of the anti-communism was really pointed at home more than overseas, although it was convenient that you had an enemy like that. I mean, if you had to sort of gauge the percentage of how much of conservative global anti-communism was directed at a domestic battle versus a strategic was directed by strategic perceptions of how much of a threat the Soviet Union posed, how would you break that down?
90% domestic. Yeah, I mean, as simple as that. And, I can't think of a lot of really sophisticated conservative foreign policy analyses from the post-war period, to be honest. Ronald Reagan, it was amazing to see the way that he was treated versus George Romney. And a lot of this does come down to the sort of struggle within the Republican Party itself. Reagan's a conservative. Romney's a moderate. George Romney's asked, what would you do about Vietnam? He's trying to be honest. He's reevaluating. He's been there. He's changed his opinions. It's complicated. We have to uphold our legacy. We can't cut and run on our allies, and yet we can maybe modulate this, and reporters just attacked him. Ronald Reagan, we should win or get out. Yay! Now that's a very easy policy, right? It's easy to say that. Doing it in practice is tough, but Republicans didn't have the responsibility for doing that during that time, so of course it's easy to say that. But again, this is all about domestic policy, and this is where McCarthyism comes in. McCarthy is really not that concerned about what goes on overseas. McCarthyism, in a lot of ways, is not really that concerned about serious penetration of communists in this period because there isn't much. There was in the late 40s, but by the time McCarthy is on a run, it's mostly been taken care of by the Truman administration. But again, what's he talking about? Even in his Wheeling speech, we have been betrayed by our elite, the best educated, wealthiest people from the most beautiful homes who've been given the best jobs in government. Again, it's this thing, you little people have been screwed by the big people. I'm going to get them for you. And this is not unsurprisingly connected to battles within the Republican Party itself for primacy between its conservative wing and more moderate or even progressive wings. What is one of the epithets that McCarthy loves to use against his opponents in the Republican Party? They're one-worlders. Where's that term come from? Comes from Wendell Willkie, his book One World, right? So it's almost all, I think, for domestic consumption, limited concern really overseas. Even Bill Buckley, writing in a candid moment to someone who says, is it my patriotic duty to enlist in the army and go fight in Vietnam? Says, some other war, not this one.
Let me just add one. I agree fundamentally with what was just said, but within intellectual circles, so if you look at the National Review between the late 40s and the mid-1950s, there actually is a battle over these issues, and the intellectuals are worried about it. And so what's his name? Burnham is the guy who kind of comes out and says, we really need to worry about the Soviet Union. We really need to reevaluate our role in the world. it's not for domestic consumption what Burnham's arguing. He's not trying to win votes. He is trying to change the policy of conservative elites, though. And George Nash does a whole nice 20 pages on this debate within conservatism that's at a very high level of thinking. And at that level, it's not just about domestic consumption. It is about trying to go past the conventional wisdom of conservatives before 1946. So, but that's 350 people worrying about a tough issue.
I mean, there is an almost eschatological dimension to this, right? Which is that, communism represents the force of evil and Satan in this world. We have to oppose the force of Satan on behalf of all that's good and Christian in this world. That is true. They're not insincere about that. But again, National Review, to what extent did even Burnham's thinking come up with a concrete white paper? The only one I can think of is the plan to preemptively nuke China to stop its development of a nuclear weapon. That's not serious policy.
Jeff, go on.
Hi, thanks. Is this on? Yeah, there we go. Thanks for that panel. It actually moved the needle on my understanding of the post-war era and post-war conservatism more specifically. And I think the idea of this eclipse of a 75-year regime, David's really interesting. And the One Accord group marching into the America First, the sense of unity, the oneness, the correctness that he talks about, that Buckley talks about. Both of those dimensions raise really important flags that I think we need to be a little more concerned about. It's elites versus little people, but it's also what's the cohesion here? And how does it work in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of creating insider-outsider senses of national citizenship? Because I sort of agree with where David was going at the end of his talk, which maybe we really need to think about something about national identity as a place of political traction. But it immediately raises questions of immigration, of civil rights, of gender, and things like that that are sort of absent from this. And so, to what extent is this an exclusive understanding of the problem?
Taft is always a good case for this because he was a social progressive. So he stood out for speaking up for African Americans in Ohio, but did not believe the federal government had any role to play in adjudicating the inequalities in the United States. So at a level of morality, he's impeccable on these issues. At the level of policy, Black Americans felt he failed them dramatically, and they voted against him at a very specific level. But I think one of the problems with disaggregating America First as a conceptual frame is that there are pieces of it that a guy like me at least thinks are complicated and worth reckoning with. And then there's, from my perspective again, incredibly ugly pieces of it. And the degree to which it can work as a disaggregated set of options is really politically suspect. And so the degree to which you lump in, we need a fair trade deal with China versus I hate people of color, gets complicated fast. So I think I'm hearing your underlying political concerns, and I am sympathetic to them. But I do think, at least at a level of policy, there's room for disaggregation and reconceptualization and policy change.
I mean, here again is where some of the battle is between the Republican Party as well as between the parties, right? I mean, Republicans voted in Congress for both the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Act in higher percentages than Democrats. And yet, once the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater in 1964, that was it. The black vote fell from 40% Republican during Eisenhower's last election, even 33% under Nixon, to 4% under Goldwater. Some of that might have been error. And the Republican Party had at that point kind of irresistibly allied itself with the forces in the South that wanted to keep segregation. And, I didn't get into it in my talk, and I haven't gone into elsewhere because these things are complicated as always. The America First had a very weak presence in the South. The South is this militaristic, indeed nationalistic region. And yet, post-war, a lot of the sort of the more isolationist sentiments against foreign aid and against international organizations are coming from the South because the fear is that the United Nations will declare Southern segregation to be illegal according to international law. So that gives a lot of energy to the move of these segregated forces in the South into the Republican Party following the Southern strategy. So these things are very complicated, but again, like there were forces within the Republican Party pushing back against this during that time, and some of this goes back, again, to the Wendell Willkie versus the Taft antagonism, though Taft himself was not a racist. He was on the side that ultimately is where the racists ended up.
Yeah, please, sure.
So is that to suggest then that the liberal internationalists tend to do better on questions of civil rights? Sorry.
Well, a lot of liberal internationalists, particularly post-war, worried that, my God, the Soviet Union is using this as propaganda. We're trying to win over these African nations, and they're showing us all these pictures of segregation in the South, white and colored fountains. This is ridiculous. We've got to end this. We can't allow this if we're going to be the leader of the free world. And of course, those considerations didn't have equal traction on the conservative side.
That's completely true. But I also think you can predate, by the 1930s, you see among liberal internationalists a desire for a more cosmopolitan view of peoples around the world. So it isn't, there's an element of self-interest. Oh my gosh, we look terrible in Kenya. But there's also a sense by the 1940s that liberal internationalists had made the move from the parochialism of the late 19th century to a different vision of humanity. I mean, I think it's that simple.
To even complicate this further, might as well. There's a sense among the conservative segments of the America First Committee that they are the ethnics who'd been oppressed in World War I, rebelling against the WASP establishment that had repressed them. And Buckley, people tend to forget this, was from a very Irish family in Texas, which kind of exacerbates the Irishness. One of Buckley's great uncles was killed in a bar brawl in Texas. And this is something that always came out, and again made him kind of the tribune of ethnic resentment because he'd been consistently pursuing this line since the time he was a boy. There's one in the front and back.
Following up on Buckley, given Buckley's ardent anti-communism, did he ever clearly explain why he thought the Vietnamese War was not worth fighting?
There again, conservatives didn't feel that they were in any way represented in the making of foreign policy. And this was true under Eisenhower, who was the Republican president, and it was true under the Democratic presidents as well. And Schlesinger had a neat little line, which is that the neo-isolationists are always most concerned about nations around the world in Asia when they've been lost to the enemy. Then suddenly they become very important. Who lost China? So sure, the Buckley and the rest of National Review was prepared to make hay out of who lost Vietnam, and this is part of what drove LBJ to stay there, right? The fear that there would be this repetition of the who lost China hysteria of the late 40s if he didn't stay in the conflict. But, again, was Buckley really committed? I mean, after the fall of Diem, thanks to, as he saw it, well, actually, as we know, machinations by both the CIA and U.S. diplomatic services, as well as the generals, he was like, oh, that's it. That was the last Vietnamese patriot who we could actually get behind. The rest of it's just going to be a bunch of rotten apples. Let's go. And there's also a sense that we've talked about before, which is that the Robert Taft position comes back into vogue on the left and the extreme right in certain ways during the 1960s. The John Birch Society opposed the Vietnam War.
Young Americans for Freedom at first.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just this feeling that this is not our war, this might be a civil war, this at any rate is a conflict that we had, if anything, we made worse and we should just get out. Pay Vietnam with parking stripes if we need to, but don't actually get involved in this policy of gradual escalation and all the rest that's doing it. I don't think Buckley felt any responsibility whatsoever for Vietnam policy. I think he felt free to criticize it from any direction he wanted to.
Was there a question there? Chris? Okay.
Thanks. That was great. So one thing I thought would be interesting for us to get into a little bit would be to touch on some of the things that David was discussing in terms of free trade, advantage trade, and changes in thinking about that over time, but to be a little more particular about which industries they're talking about. And as you think about the America First concept as it pertains both to sort of genuine economic projections of what will benefit the U.S. versus a kind of domestic political consumption about economics a sort of nostalgia economics, right? If you think about the contemporary moment, there are very few coal miners, but a lot of people who identify with the tradition of coal mining. So too, you could argue in different historical eras, you get a kind of America First orientation there. So the question is really revolving around, what are the projections here? How are they calculating particular industries and particular sorts of approaches to advantage trade and trade protectionism and tariffs? And what are the longer legacies, both looking backwards and forwards?
There's people in this room who know this stuff better than me, but I'll just bring up one incident that I think is so fascinating. And this is in again, that sort of hinge period of the late 60s and early 70s when Nixon has taken over and he and Kissinger are trying to rethink some really critical issues around the world. They're making paradigmatic breaks. And George Shultz, Labor Secretary, keeps kind of like raising his hand and saying to them, you guys aren't thinking at all about the international economy. And he says all of these prescient things over and over again. And now he is a very ardent pro-free trader. He wants to see massive international economic investment by the Americans around the world. But they're not thinking about it, is my point. And I'm stealing this from Daniel Sargent's really cool new book. And so, again, the idea that elites are all sitting around a table and they've all got their eye on the exact prize and they're really conscious of what's going to be happening 5 and 10 years later. This is a great example where there's Schultz, who is as an elite a man as you can get, who really does see it. He sees the trajectory over the next one. But the bosses don't. So their eyes just somewhere else. And I always thought that was such a great example of, again, trade had become kind of conventionalized. A lot of people weren't thinking terribly hard about it at critical juncture points. And that struck me as, again, the ways in which a liberal internationalist perspective, which was forged in a very particular time, just kind of gets on a glide path. And it's hard to disrupt a whole series of agreements and understandings and conventional ways of approaching the problem. Schultz saw it. He's a cool guy.
Yes, question over here. Just 1 second, we'll get the microphone. Yeah.
I think mine is a follow-on to the prior question when you spoke, David, about sort of maybe First America wasn't the worst idea. And when I think about comments in the Journal of the Economist, one of the more humorous ones about Trump was, in their great frustration about his protectionist view, the guy would know the difference between David Ricardo and Ricky Ricardo. And I think there seems to be this anti-intellectual trend, and what I really get confused about is, the issue about sort of free trade, comparative advantage, where we have generally been such a beneficiary of that, and now we seem to be moving in a world where sort of, extremist guys like Navarro, whom I think are, and guys like Gary Cohen, who are pretty well schooled, walking out the door. And I just have a sense of, do we really know where we're heading, and does the administration? And I think NAFTA is a great example about, well, boy, we're going to lose X number of jobs for every new job, but if we give these guys a special sort of relationship, we won't. And I guess, do you guys have a sense of where trade is moving? I think it's worrisome to me.
It's hard to disentangle, isn't it? Hard to go backward, the way things work nowadays. Any large company that's successful in the United States. I always tell my students, when I look out at them, I go, the reason you're getting a college education is that globalization is really good for you. But for your brothers and sisters who chose not to come to college, tough luck on them, huh, buddies? Right? I mean, this is going to be very difficult for them. And I think as a policy, we haven't thought through very well that divide within the United States of those who suffer and those who don't, and those who benefit immensely, like probably almost all of us in this room, from the trends that have developed. So I think the politics of it becomes so blunt when somebody like Trump manages them that it's hard to see the truth in some of his prescriptions, because his policies often don't advance a larger agenda. You know, it'll be interesting what actually develops in terms of trade reforms over the next 3 or 4 years. There's plenty of room for reform. I mean, I'm a Walter Mondale Democrat. I've mentioned it briefly. I mean, I think we need to have massive policies that help Americans figure out how to make their spaces in a new economic world, and we haven't done very well on that score. So that's my policy prescription. I'm a believer in international trade, but I also believe, like almost every other aspect of capitalism, it's fierce and brutal, and people lose, and we as a society have to figure out what we want to do about those people who don't take best advantage of what is overall an engine for prosperity. That's far.
Thank you. But David, isn't it true that Roosevelt's own conception of liberal internationalism provided for both an open international order, nurturing world trade and America engagement commercially with the world, reconciled directly with a commitment to a very activist state at home that would in part redress the very problems that Roosevelt and some of his advisors understood were inevitably engendered by an open world order. And the idea was to couple these things together. One of the most striking things about Roosevelt's commitments at, just before he died, both in 1944 and 1945, when he gave his State of the Union address, was once again to reaffirm we're committed to an open world, we're committed, to the 4 freedoms. But that then was coupled with numerous paragraphs about we also need a strong state at home. We need the state to promote housing. We need the state to promote research. We need the state to support business. We need the state to have better farm prices. And these two things were inherently reconciled together. And that was the heart of liberal internationalism during its heyday. So these agreements that you say, liberal state, it made sense at one point, but by the 1970s, it just carried on because of perpetual motion. And I would suggest it didn't carry on just because of perpetual motion. It carried on because liberal internationalism promoted unprecedented peace amongst great powers, and also led to unprecedented prosperity. Maybe some workers were displaced, but the majority of workers in the United States and the majority of farmers supported liberal internationalism during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, partly because it was coupled with strong action by the state at home and complementary. So when we want to I think some of this discussion almost normalizes America First too much and sort of trivializes the unique successes of liberal internationalism. And I think one of the things we need to do at a conference like this is really analyze what aspects of liberal internationalism have failed, if they have failed, and what are the remedies to that? Does America First really provide the remedies to these problems? I think that's a really critical issue. Anyway, I've talked too long, and I know Dale Copeland wanted, and then, okay, Andrew, the microphone is there.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Thanks for that panel. That was fantastic. I wish that Bev Gage were here, because I'd ask her a question that I'm going to ask for the rest of the panelists too. And I was really taken with her framing of the FBI as a kind of alphabet agency. And then when you think of what Truman after the war couldn't accomplish with the fair deal, and then if we think of the national security state, the emerging national security state, as part of the fair deal, and we think of from 1947 to 52, things like the JCS and the NSC and the CIA, and in 1952 the National Security Agency, all these bodies that are created to wage the Cold War, those are the last of the alphabet agencies. And so my question to the panel, but I guess especially to Jeff, is we think a lot about sort of America First as an antithesis to liberal internationalism and the ideology of liberal internationalism. But as Mel was just saying, what about the liberal state, which conservatives of all stripes, including populists or America Firsters or whatever, grassroots conservatives, have a really ambivalent relationship with. So what do they think of the national security state? What do they think of what Eisenhower calls the military-industrial complex, which the fact that Eisenhower was warning about it says a lot about the complexities and how this kind of thing doesn't fall down necessarily on a straight line.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that in a paper about McCarthyism, it's only Hoover that's mentioned. But then again, that's consistent with Ellen Schrecker's conclusion that McCarthyism in many ways ought to be called Hooverism, since Hoover was the motivating force behind it. And one of the things I got out of Buckley's papers, Buckley and his brother-in-law Brent Bozell co-wrote a defense of McCarthy as Buckley's second book, and they were heavily under the influence of Wilmore Kendall, who believed that the Founding Fathers did not actually intend to pass the Bill of Rights, and particularly the First Amendment was a big mistake and should be revoked immediately, because what was needed was a kind of community that could coerce conformity to its norms, to come back to this idea again. And Buckley loved Hoover because Hoover is what he saw as doing that, and one thinks particularly of Hoover's relationship to the civil rights movement. Was he acting out of racism as such? I wouldn't say so, but he certainly didn't want the status quo to be disturbed. And he saw these people as being disturbed, and he was very receptive to the idea that it must be communists behind it, because who else would want to bring such disruption to the American way of life? And as far as the relationship to the big state goes, well, obviously, the conservatives understood that some degree of government military was necessary to wage the Cold War around the globe, and this would entail big government on some level, and made some level of peace with it, but not always. And then again, even the conservative movement starts changing, and the Republican Party changes too. It's a funny thing. It's a completely overlooked episode of history within the party itself, but there's this big outcry from the Eastern wing following Nixon's pursuit of the Southern strategy, because it's bringing in these people who don't subscribe to our view of capitalism. Right? The South has never been about free markets. The South has been about extractive industries and agriculture and textiles, and all these things cry out for government protection in some form or another and subsidy, and they capture the agencies that deal with them, and they demand tariffs of various kinds, and we should not be letting these people into the Republican Party, racial issues and other things aside, just on sheer economic grounds. And this is part of the moderates swamping, is that their protest goes unheard, and yet the character of the Republican Party does change markedly after that, and in some ways it makes peace with the aspect of the state that the Southerners had liked, which is this economic aspect.
So conservatism is another odd job word that doesn't really have a clean definition. And when you go all the way back to pick a year, let's say the 1920s, conservatives believed in a very muscular state, but in a very particular kind of muscular state. And prohibition is this wonderful example of a conservative movement, a conservative progressivism that demanded a massive intervention at everyday life of the American people. And you can follow that with the Narcotics Bureau, the Drug Enforcement Agency. These are all, and then most obviously and lavishly, defense spending. Now, are there libertarian conservatives who say, oh my goodness, these are terrible developments, they were a huge mistake? Of course. But they've been the predominant impulse in a conservative movement, which is different than a conservative ideology. So muscular state development is as intrinsic to practical conservatism as it is to liberalism.
Okay, I think we have time for two questions. Dale and then Philip Zelikow.
Great, thanks. Very interesting panel. This is a question largely for David. One of the things that strikes me, I love your comparison of Taft versus Eisenhower and what they were after. But one of the things that strikes me that was embedded in your discussion, and that could be broadened out, is that in fact they were fighting over two different aspects of the strategic logic here. One is about what is the best means to our end, and that's obviously free trade versus protectionism. But perhaps more importantly, they were fighting over whether our ends, our ultimate ends, are security or national security versus, say, parochial
wealth maximization for certain regions, certain sectors, certain industries. And it seems that what Eisenhower was all about in the 50s was we have to use free trade, or you call it advantage trade, to help others and build our larger sphere, because that's about the Cold War and winning the Cold War. That's national security as the end, free trade is the means. And the other end of the spectrum was Taft, who was parochial in the sense that he seemed to be fighting for certain regions or certain industries and believing protectionism was the best policy. And why I think this division is important, and you can sort of conceptualize it as a 2x2, but why I think this is an interesting way to approach this is if we go back in American history, what we see right from the time of Hamilton is some elites, elites arguing for protectionism for national security reasons, which in the 1790s made sense because, after all, we were a small power, we had no bargaining power, we had to build our industry. And then others who argue for free trade for security reasons, and then others who I think are like Trump, or at least Steve Bannon, who I dislike both individuals, but I think what their logic is that we are not like Hamilton's U.S., we are the Mack truck in this economic relationship, and we're not using our power for our power interests and for our national security, and therefore we can use our power tactically, using tariffs to bargain for better deals within this global economic environment. It's not therefore retrenchment economically. It's not therefore isolationism economically. It's a bargaining ploy in the short term to actually assert ourselves and do better in the global economy. So what I'm trying to get you to think about, or at least ask, is whether Trump is actually more in a way a realist bargainer for global hegemony for the U.S., for potentially, at least in a Bannon sense, national security, rather than a parochial, Taft-like person.
Coal miners.
Yeah, but that's, again, it's a coalition-building logic there.
Well, all I'm saying is you're providing a very coherent and logical approach to the problem, and it could be that Trump is that clever, and I do think that some of this is bargaining power and trying to make leverage, and I'm all for that. But I don't know that Trump is as logically coherent as you're hoping he is, in so much as he is a politician at this point in his life, and he is trying to maintain certain constituencies, and those constituencies often are folks that don't add probably to long-term prosperity. So I don't know where he's going to come out on all this, or where his trade advisors are really working toward. It's hard to say at this point. We'll see what the deals are.
Trump comes out of the New York real estate world. That's his view of business. He exults in the fact that in those transactions, someone wins and someone loses. And he, Trump, always comes out on top, getting the better of the bargain. The idea that all parties are somehow better off in a system of the kind that the United States maintained after World War II is somewhat foreign to this way of thinking. Trump doesn't see it in the United States' interest to maintain a system where all might be better off. He again thinks of it as like, we're going to get the better of these people in our trade deals, or they're going to get the better of us.
But very quickly, it's not protectionism in the 30 sense.
Dale.
It's not protectionism in the 30 sense. It's Trump saying, I want a better deal for the U.S. in NAFTA. I want a better deal with China. It's not, we're going to retreat completely. That would be really quite protectionistic. But this is, I can bargain with you guys because I'm the Mack truck in the chicken release.
That's certainly the way he frames it, right? That's the way he would want you to think about it, Dale. He's convinced you. That's excellent. So,
but you know,
I don't agree. It's a good strategy.
I mean, again, if you want to draw the link back to the America First Committee and particularly the conservative strand of it, there's simply this belief that the rest of the world cannot be trusted. Yeah. They are not like us. They are foreign. They will seek to take advantage of us. Therefore, we ought not to deal with them if that's possible, or if we deal with them, do so very suspiciously and always guarding our own interests. That's a very consistent strand in American thinking. That's right.
One last question, Philip.
Yes, I really wanted to follow up on, I thought, Mr. Kabaservis's powerful insight about thinking of this as elites versus other elites. And Mr. Farber also followed up on that. It's like, look at the particular economic interests with your Alfred Sloan example. Because you can make an argument, and I think this is not the way people see the 50s. is that the conservatives in the 50s that you're portraying are actually more authoritarian than their opponents. Let me start on the economic side of this, which is the less obvious version of this. In general, the people who support the liberal international order, many of them are in the South and Midwest. Pretty much if you're producing raw commodities, you want free trade. If you're a cotton planter or a cotton broker, or you're a farmer, or you're in mining, in the 40s and 50s, you want free trade. The people who don't, like even in the South, when you cite in your paper, Cotton Ed Smith in South Carolina, he's representing big textile. Textile industries are against free trade. The low country cotton folks love free trade. Will Clayton is a Texas cotton broker from Texas who's creating the general agreements on tariffs and trade. So, but the people who want to control free trade need lots and lots of government authority and government preferential treatment and government intervention in order to get all those outcomes. And that's part of what runs them into Eisenhower, who actually is something of a libertarian conservatism in his sort of homespun beliefs, as Hitchcock's book points out. Then take this into the political and social side. The two most authoritarian things the U.S. government does in the 1950s are McCarthyism and Jim Crow, in terms of government intervention to police the everyday social lives and lives of citizens. Those are the two most authoritarian trends of the 1950s, and the old guard Republicans and the old America Firsters are supportive of them both. James Burnham, I would argue, actually is a very authoritarian thinker. In many ways, in the 1940s, he had been a Trotskyite, and in the 1940s, I think he's a proto-fascist, who then decides that he's more anti-communist, but he's an authoritarian thinker. And I think actually your comments strongly and interestingly bring out Buckley's ambivalent relationship with all of this and your notion of actually their desire for coercive conformity. This is such a different image of conservatism as authoritarian and big government supportive than I think the commonplace image of conservatism, that I think it's a really powerful insight that seems to me to emerge from your comments on this panel.
I would argue that Buckley is not exactly seeking to use the power of big government to coerce this conformity. In the case of the South, he simply wants the South to be left alone to work out its own destiny, as the saying was, which implies an absence of big government. And indeed, National Review goes ballistic when Eisenhower sends federal troops to intervene in Little Rock. They see this as just an enormous crime. But
had already been deployed in Little Rock to keep the kids out of the schools, and he had to federalize the guard.
Federalize the guard, yes, that's true. Again, though, this is sort of the states' rights aspect of the conservatism of that period, that the federal government is the one to worry about, but the state, maybe the state is your friend. It represents the people and the will of the people. There is this real sense of the Rousseauian kind of volonté générale surfacing in conservative thought, though I'm sure they'd be the first to deny they have any kind of debt to the French in any way. And as far as the other aspect of it goes, again, I think Buckley wanted a coerced conformism that would come from society itself.
That's what
And the norms of society, and kept pushing the cultural issue because he sees like the media, maybe as run by Jews, but certainly as not expressing the will of the people, as always pushing for change and unsettling of the status quo and disturbing the way that the American people should be and the way the American people want it to be. And he thought that the pushback should come maybe from a figure like McCarthy, but more generally just from condemnation and censoriousness and ostracism of people who do not adhere to the American way of life. And I think this is the commonality with Hoover and to some extent with McCarthy. They all sort of seek the same end, but somewhat different means.
Okay, I think we can wrap this up. Thanks very much. This has been a terrific session. We will reconvene again at 1 o'clock. Okay, thank you.